My stepfather always promised to treat me like his own, until he sided with his biological kids and kicked me out. This made me angry, and then growing up, I never imagined I'd be the kind of person to turn on my own family. But I guess that's because I was raised believing we were a real family, that my stepfather, David, was just as much my dad as he was to his own kids. It's funny how easily I bought into the idea. I was only 6 when my mom remarried David, and for a while, I was convinced he was everything a father could be. David came into our lives not long after my mom, Laura, and I had gone through some rough times. My biological father had left when I was too young to remember much, just fragments of a man who promised he'd be back for Christmas and never showed. So when David stepped in, a tall, steady, and endlessly patient guy, I was drawn to him immediately. He seemed like a real dad, someone who took me fishing, taught me how to throw a baseball, and even sat through my painful attempts at learning the saxophone. He was there at every recital, every game, and every important event. My mom would look at him with such gratitude, and for years, I felt like I had finally won in the family department. But as much as David tried to make me feel like one of his own, there were always small signs that I wasn't entirely a part of their world. I grew up alongside David's 2 kids from his previous marriage, Chase and Bella. Chase was only a couple of years older than me, and Bella was about 2 years younger. I was smack in the middle, which seemed like a perfect position for me, or so I thought. David treated us equally, at least on the surface. He'd say things like, "Ryan, you're just as much my son as Chase is, and I don't see you any differently, buddy." But looking back, I think I needed those reassurances because deep down, I always suspected that he did see me differently. For a long time, I brushed off the small things. Chase always got the newer toys or the bigger slice of cake. Bella could get away with murder, and David would find a way to explain it away. If I got into trouble, though, I'd get to talk about respect, responsibility, and being grateful. David would look me right in the eyes and say, "You know, I only push you hard because I want the best for you." And I believed him. I thought, maybe he just sees me as the one with potential, the one who has to work a bit harder. Maybe I should be grateful. One thing that always struck me was how often David reminded me that family was everything. He'd say, "In this family, we stick together. We protect each other." It was a nice sentiment, and I held on to it, especially through high school, when things got a bit rough. Chase and I started drifting apart, with him often being David's right-hand man around the house. He was a natural at all things mechanical and handy, the kind of guy who could fix a car with duct tape and determination. I, on the other hand, was more academic and quiet, preferring a book to a wrench. Bella was the family princess, and I mean that literally. She got everything she asked for and then some. But still, I felt like we were a family, my family. One memory that sticks with me is from my high school graduation. I wasn't a valedictorian or anything, but I was proud of myself, and I thought David was too. He shook my hand in front of everyone, pulling me in for a side hug and said, "You did good, son." My mom was in tears, and I genuinely felt like I'd made him proud. But later that night, I overheard him talking to Chase about how Chase needed to keep his grades up because "You're my legacy, son. You're the one who'll carry on the family name." It stung, but I told myself I was reading into it too much. It was just a passing comment, right? Besides, David had told me I was like a son to him, hadn't he? But as the years went on, those little differences in how we were treated started to add up. Chase got a new car when he turned 18. A gift from David, of course. I got an old, beat-up sedan that David said was character building because you learn to appreciate things when you work for them. Bella, of course, got a car too, a shiny one, because it's different for girls, according to David. Still, I held on to the belief that these were small things and that David treated me differently because he believed in tough love. I figured maybe he was just trying to prepare me for the real world. When I graduated college, things got tougher. I moved back home, trying to save up for my own place while juggling a new job. David let me stay, but it was clear that he saw it as temporary, a sort of grace period. Chase, on the other hand, had moved back in after his marriage fell apart, and Bella was living at home too. Chase was going through a rough patch, and David was understanding, always offering a listening ear and even some financial help. I figured maybe it was just because they were having a hard time and I could manage on my own. Then, a few months ago, things took a hard turn. My job didn't pan out as expected, and suddenly, I found myself struggling to make ends meet. I was shocked when David sat me down one night and said, "Ryan, it's time you find your own way." I thought he meant some motivational pep talk about resilience. But when I looked up, I realized he was serious. He expected me to move out. "But Chase and Bella are still here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Chase has had a tough year, and Bella's still figuring things out. They're my kids." "It's different," he said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. In that moment, I realized something I'd been avoiding for years. I was never really one of them. David had been saying all the right things, but when it mattered most, he'd choose his blood over me every time. I tried to explain that I just needed a bit more time to get back on my feet, but David wouldn't hear it. "You're a grown man now, Ryan. It's time to stand on your own," he said, as if he was doing me some kind of favor by pushing me out. I felt my stomach twist, but I didn't let him see it. In the following weeks, things got colder between us. Chase and Bella acted like nothing was wrong, but I felt like a ghost in my own home. For the first time, I felt like an outsider looking in on a family that wasn't really mine. It hurt more than I wanted to admit, but I kept my head down, determined to figure something out. I'd been told all my life that I was one of them, but that was just a lie I told myself to feel safe. I never thought I'd reach a breaking point with my own family. But as I started packing my things, the resentment began to build. I wasn't just being kicked out of a house. I was being kicked out of my own family. And something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let them push me out without a fight. Moving out wasn't easy, but I did it. I managed to get a tiny apartment across town. It was nothing special, cramped, with paper-thin walls and the constant hum of traffic outside my window, but it was mine. I told myself this was just the start of my independence, that I was better off without David's judgmental looks and silent accusations. But the resentment festered. How could he throw me out like that when Chase and Bella were living comfortably at home? I tried to get back on my feet, taking whatever jobs I could find, but the hits kept coming. My field was competitive, and layoffs had left me scrambling. I reached out to David once, swallowing my pride to ask for just a little help, maybe even a loan to tide me over. I thought maybe he'd show a hint of the compassion he used to have when I was younger, but he barely listened. He cut me off halfway through, saying, "Ryan, you're a grown man. It's time to make your own way." It was like a script he'd memorized, the same words he'd thrown at me when he told me to leave. I didn't want to hear it. I hung up before I could say something I'd regret. Things only got worse when I found out Chase had moved back in, even after everything David had said about it being time for me to find my own path. Apparently, Chase had lost his job, too, and David had welcomed him back with open arms, like it was his duty to help him through this rough patch. I couldn't believe the double standard. David hadn't even blinked when I'd reached out for help, but for Chase, there was always room. A few weeks later, I went back to the house to pick up some things I'd left behind. Walking through the front door felt surreal, like I was stepping into someone else's life. Bella was sprawled out on the living room couch, watching TV like she didn't have a care in the world. She barely looked up when I came in. Chase was sitting at the kitchen table, talking with David about some job leads, the two of them sharing a laugh like they were best friends. David saw me and gave a stiff nod. Not exactly warm, but not entirely dismissive either. It was as if he was trying to be polite, like I was a guest in their home instead of his stepson. I tried to keep my emotions in check, but it was hard seeing them all so comfortable, carrying on with their lives like I was some distant relative stopping by. I went up to my old room, which David had already started turning into a storage space, stacking boxes and furniture along one wall. It was clear he didn't plan on me coming back. The room felt foreign, stripped of anything that had once made it mine. I grabbed the last of my things, mostly some old books and clothes, and left without saying a word to anyone. Back in my apartment that night, I thought about how my life had changed so drastically in just a few months. I'd gone from having a family to being alone, and it felt like everyone else was moving forward while I was stuck, barely scraping by. I was furious, not just at David, but at myself for ever believing I was really part of his family. I'd given him so much loyalty, trusted him as my father, and now it was clear that I'd been living in a fantasy. But I still couldn't shake the sense of betrayal, the feeling that he owed me something more than this cold indifference. My anger simmered until I couldn't stand it anymore. I decided I needed to confront him, to make him understand how deeply he'd hurt me. I called him up and asked if we could meet for coffee. I wanted a neutral setting, somewhere he couldn't brush me off. We met at a small cafe near his work. David looked uncomfortable as soon as he sat down, like he'd rather be anywhere else. He ordered a black coffee, barely making eye contact with me as we sat in tense silence. I decided to get straight to the point. David, I don't understand why you treated me the way you did. You always told me I was like a son to you. But when I needed help, you pushed me away. He sighed, his expression hardening. Ryan, I didn't push you away. I gave you the chance to grow up, to become your own man. That's what you wanted, isn't it? I clenched my fists under the table. That's not what you gave me, David. You kicked me out while letting Chase and Bella stay. No questions asked. How is that fair? They're going through rough times, he replied, his voice infuriatingly calm. Chase just went through a divorce, and Bella's still finding her way. They need a support system right now, and I didn't. I shot back, my voice rising. I lost my job too, David. I just needed a bit of help, but you threw me out like I was nothing. His face darkened. Ryan, I told you. You're a grown man. Chase and Bella are my kids. I have a responsibility to them. It was like a slap in the face. He'd finally said what I'd feared for years. I wasn't his responsibility. I was just the kid of the woman he married, someone he could brush aside when things got inconvenient. I leaned forward, trying to keep my voice steady. You lied to me, David. You told me I was part of this family. But when it really mattered, you chose them over me. He didn't respond right away, just looked out the window like he was tired of the conversation. Finally, he said, Ryan, maybe it's time for you to let go of these expectations. You're old enough to stand on your own 2 feet. Life isn't always fair, and family dynamics are complicated. I sat there in stunned silence, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. I'd spent years trying to be a part of this family, believing his words, only to be discarded like I didn't matter. The bitterness in my chest grew, taking root as I sat there. David looked relieved when I finally stood up, as if he'd been waiting for me to walk away. I left the cafe without saying another word, my mind racing. I'd been told all my life that family was about loyalty, about sticking together through the hard times. But for David, that loyalty had limits, limits that didn't extend to me. As the weeks went on, I struggled to move on, but every day felt heavier than the last. I felt like I was constantly fighting against the weight of his rejection, the harsh reality that I wasn't truly part of his family. And just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I learned something that pushed me over the edge. One day, while grabbing coffee in town, I ran into an old family friend who casually mentioned that David was planning to sell the family home. The house I grew up in, the only home I'd ever known, was going to be sold. He was going to leave it all behind without a second thought, making it clear that he didn't care about the memories, about the life we'd built together. I was livid. He was moving on with his real family, discarding me and everything that had ever connected us. The home I'd lived in for most of my life was about to disappear, along with any last tie I had to him and the family I thought was mine. As I sat there, fuming, I knew I couldn't let it happen. He could choose his biological kids over me, but he couldn't just erase me from his life like I was nothing. I had to do something drastic. I wasn't going to just sit back and watch him take away everything I'd ever known. So I made a decision. If David was determined to push me out, then I was going to push back. I was going to fight for what I believed was mine, and I knew exactly where to start. The decision to fight David wasn't one I took lightly. After all, he'd been my father figure for as long as I could remember. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I had no choice. He had promised me that I was part of his family, his son. Yet, when push came to shove, he'd made it clear that I wasn't. I couldn't just let him wipe me out of his life and take away everything I'd thought was ours, everything that was supposed to be home. At first, I tried to reason with him. I went to the house one last time, hoping I could somehow get him to understand how deeply he was hurting me. I caught him in the garage, working on one of his old projects, tinkering away at an engine he'd been trying to restore for years. I walked up, feeling my stomach twist as I prepared for yet another conversation that would probably end in him dismissing me. "David," I began, trying to keep my tone calm, "I heard you're planning to sell the house." He looked up, his expression unreadable, and wiped his hands on an old rag. "Yeah, that's right. It's time for a fresh start, don't you think?" "No," I replied, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "I don't think it is. This house means a lot to me. I grew up here, just like Chase and Bella." He sighed, setting down his tools as if I were wasting his time. "Ryan, you're going to have to move on. This is part of life." Chase and Bella are on board with the idea. We all agreed it was time to close this chapter. My blood boiled. "Did you even think to ask me how I felt about it? Or am I just supposed to disappear from your life without a trace?" David rubbed his temples like he was tired of dealing with me. "Ryan, don't make this harder than it has to be. The house is going up for sale, and that's final." His dismissal was the last straw. I realized then that he wasn't going to change his mind, and he didn't care how much he'd hurt me. To him, I was just an inconvenience, someone he could push aside when it suited him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, replaying his words over and over in my head, feeling the anger and betrayal build up inside me until it was almost unbearable. I thought about everything he'd promised me, all those years he'd spent telling me I was part of his family. And now, he was ready to wipe me out of his life without so much as a second thought. I knew I needed help if I was going to fight him. I didn't have the resources or the influence to take him on alone, but I knew someone who did. My uncle, Mark. My mom's older brother, Mark, was the only family I had left on her side. He was a successful attorney, well-connected, and fiercely loyal to family. I hadn't talked to him much over the years, but I knew he'd always had a soft spot for me. He'd been close to my mom, and I hoped that connection would be enough to get him on my side. I called Mark the next morning and explained everything. The way David had kicked me out, the double standard with Chase and Bella, and now, his plan to sell the house. Mark listened in silence, and when I finished, there was a long pause. "Ryan," he finally said, his voice steady, "I'm sorry you've had to go through this. I can't believe he's doing this to you after all these years. But I think I can help." A wave of relief washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone was on my side. Mark told me he'd look into the legal side of things, and he promised to call me back with a plan. I hung up, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could fight this. The next few days were a blur. Mark worked quickly, digging into the details of the property and the investments my mom had made in the house over the years. He called me one evening with news that changed everything. "Ryan," he said, his tone serious, "I've looked into the ownership of the house, and I think we have a case. When your mother married David, she invested a significant amount of her own money into the property. Legally, she has a stake in it, which means that, technically, you might be entitled to a portion of the property." My heart raced. "So you're saying we could actually stop him from selling it?" "Possibly," Mark replied, "but it won't be easy. David's name is on the deed, and he'll have his own legal team. But with the evidence we have, I think we have a strong case to claim that you're entitled to a share of the property, if not the house itself." The reality of what I was about to do started to sink in. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a full-blown legal battle, but I knew I couldn't back down. I couldn't let David erase me from his life, from my own life, like I was nothing. I thanked Mark, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. This was my chance to fight back, to make David realize that he couldn't just discard me like I didn't matter. A few weeks later, the papers were filed. David was served with a lawsuit challenging the sale of the house and demanding that I be recognized as a beneficiary of my mother's investments in the property. I knew it would come as a shock to him, and part of me felt a twisted sense of satisfaction at the thought of him finally facing the consequences of his actions. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. David was furious. He called me the day after he was served, his voice practically shaking with anger. "Ryan, what the hell is this?" he demanded. "You're suing me? Do you have any idea what you're doing?" I stayed calm, though my heart was pounding. "I'm fighting for what's mine, David. You can't just throw me out and erase me from this family. I have a right to this house." He laughed, but it was bitter, not amused. "You have no right to anything. I raised you, Ryan. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me? By dragging me into court? You didn't raise me, David. You kept me around as long as it was convenient for you. And now that you don't need me anymore, you're throwing me away. I'm not going to let that happen." There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could practically feel his anger radiating through the phone. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and cold. "Fine. You want to fight? You'll get one. But don't come crying to me when this blows up in your face." He hung up, and I sat there, feeling a mix of fear and satisfaction. I knew he'd fight me with everything he had, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a chance. The legal process was grueling. David hired a high-powered attorney, someone known for his ruthless tactics and willingness to drag cases out for as long as it took to win. Mark warned me that it would be a long and exhausting battle, but he was with me every step of the way, preparing me for depositions, gathering evidence, and making sure we had everything we needed to make our case. The family tension was unbearable. Chase and Bella turned on me completely, acting as if I were some stranger who'd come to steal from them. They stopped talking to me, blocking me on social media and avoiding me whenever I saw them in town. Friends of the family started whispering, spreading rumors about me being greedy, trying to take advantage of David. I was painted as the villain, the ungrateful stepson who'd betrayed his family for money. But I knew the truth, and I held on to that, refusing to let their opinions shake me. Months passed, and the court date finally arrived. As I sat in that courtroom, watching David on the other side of the room, I felt a mix of anger and sadness. This was the man who'd been my father for most of my life, the man who'd once told me I was his son. And now, we were on opposite sides, fighting over the very thing that was supposed to be our home. David took the stand, painting a picture of himself as a devoted father who'd done nothing but love and support me. He spoke about the sacrifices he'd made, the difficult decision to encourage me to live independently, and how heartbroken he was that I'd turned against him like this. His attorney played it up, portraying me as a greedy young man looking to take advantage of his generosity. But Mark was ready. He presented evidence of my mother's contributions to the house, her investments that had built the home just as much as David's had. He showed financial records, documents that proved my mother had a stake in the property that couldn't simply be erased. As the judge reviewed the evidence, I felt a sense of vindication. I knew I might not win the case, but I'd finally told my side of the story. David couldn't ignore me, couldn't brush me aside anymore. The court's decision was due in a few weeks, and as we left that courtroom, I realized that no matter the outcome, I'd already won something. My dignity, my right to fight for myself. But I hoped with everything in me that I'd win the case, too, and finally have a place I could truly call my own. The waiting period was excruciating. Every day, I felt the pressure building, the weight of what I was doing pressing down on me. I'd gone from being David's stepson to his enemy. And now that our battle was public, it felt like everyone in our small community had an opinion on the family lawsuit. People whispered, looked at me differently, some even stopped talking to me entirely. I could feel the judgment from every side, but I knew I couldn't back down. This was about standing up for myself and claiming the life I felt I'd been robbed of. Mark kept me focused, constantly gathering new evidence and preparing me for every possible outcome. He reminded me that this wasn't just about money or property. It was about respect, about refusing to be pushed aside. And while I appreciated his support, the entire experience was exhausting. I'd gone from feeling like I had no one on my side to suddenly having to defend myself against the people who were supposed to be my family. The stress weighed on me, and as the weeks passed, I started to wonder if it was all worth it. The court date arrived, and as I walked into the room, I could feel the tension. David sat on one side with his high-priced attorney, and beside him were Chase and Bella. They didn't look at me, their faces cold and distant, as if I were a stranger instead of the person who had shared their lives for so many years. David shot me a look that I can only describe as pure loathing. In his eyes, I'd betrayed him, disgraced his family, and exposed a side of him he'd never wanted the world to see. The proceedings were intense. David's lawyer was relentless, painting me as an entitled, greedy young man who was just looking for a payout. He argued that I was manipulating my mother's memory to take something that didn't belong to me. I could feel my anger rising as he twisted the facts, ignoring the years I'd spent in that house. The years David had promised me I was his family. Then it was my turn to testify. Mark had coached me on what to say, but as I looked around the courtroom, the memories of my childhood came flooding back. I thought about all the times David had called me his son, about the nights he'd told me I was just as much a part of his family as Chase and Bella. I told the court everything, how David had taken me in, made me feel like his own, only to discard me when it no longer suited him. I shared how he'd kicked me out while letting Chase and Bella stay, how he'd planned to erase me from the home I'd grown up in without a second thought. I spoke about the promises he'd made, the lies he'd told, and how he'd made me feel like I didn't matter. The tension in the room was palpable as I spoke. I could see the judge's expression shift, his gaze narrowing as he listened to my story. And for the first time, I felt like someone was truly hearing me, understanding what I'd been through. It was a powerful moment, and I could see David squirming in his seat, his face growing redder with every word I said. Then Mark presented the evidence, the financial records showing my mother's contributions to the house, the legal documents proving she had a stake in the property. He argued that my mother's investment meant that I, as her son, was entitled to a portion of the property, if not the house itself. He explained that David couldn't simply ignore my mother's contributions or erase me from her legacy. David's lawyer fought back, questioning my intentions, trying to make it seem like I was after a quick payday. But I stood my ground, refusing to let him intimidate me. I knew this was about more than money. It was about principle, about honoring my mother's memory and claiming what I felt was rightfully mine. The judge listened carefully, asking questions, clarifying details, and taking in every piece of evidence. As the proceedings dragged on, I felt like I was reliving every painful moment of the past few months, every betrayal, every broken promise. But I pushed through, determined to see this through to the end. Finally, the judge called for a recess, giving us a break before he announced his decision. I stepped outside to catch my breath, my hands shaking from the intensity of the trial. Mark joined me, giving me a reassuring pat on the back. "You did great in there, Ryan," he said, his voice steady. "No matter what happens, you stood up for yourself. That takes guts." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Thanks, Mark. I just hope it was worth it." We waited in tense silence, the weight of everything hanging over us. When the judge called us back into the courtroom, my heart pounded in my chest, and I felt like the entire world was holding its breath. The judge's decision was like a punch to the gut, but a good one. He ruled in my favor, recognizing my mother's contributions to the house and awarding me partial ownership. It wasn't a complete win, but it was a victory nonetheless. David would be forced to either buy me out or allow me to take possession of the house. As the judge finished reading his decision, I glanced over at David. His face was pale, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. Chase and Bella looked equally stunned, their carefully crafted narrative of a greedy stepson crumbling in front of them. They lost, and they knew it. Outside the courtroom, David approached me, his jaw clenched. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he couldn't seem to find the words. Finally, he spat out, "You've ruined this family, Ryan. I hope you're happy." I met his gaze, feeling a surge of emotions, anger, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. "No, David," I replied, my voice steady. "You're the one who ruined this family when you chose to push me out. I just refused to let you erase me." With that, I turned and walked away, feeling a strange sense of liberation. The battle was over, and I'd won. But it came at a price. The family I'd once clung to was gone, replaced by bitterness and broken relationships. But in the end, I knew I'd done the right thing. I'd stood up for myself, for my mother's memory, and for everything I believed was right. Mark congratulated me, clapping me on the shoulder and telling me how proud he was of me. He'd been more than just a lawyer. He'd been my support, my family when I felt like I had no one else. I thanked him, feeling a surge of gratitude for everything he'd done. As I walked away from the courthouse, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. I'd won the house, the symbol of my childhood and everything I'd fought for. But I'd lost my family in the process, or at least the illusion of one. David, Chase, Bella, they'd never truly been my family, and maybe they never would be. But I had something they could never take from me, my own sense of self-worth and the knowledge that I'd fought for what was right. The house was mine now, and with it came a new beginning, a chance to build a life on my own terms. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done letting other people define me. I was ready to start fresh, to make a life that was truly mine, free from the shadow of David and his broken promises. As I walked away, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders, replaced by a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. I was finally free, finally ready to build a future where I didn't have to question my place or my worth. It was just me now, me in the house that I'd fought so hard to keep. Standing on the front porch of the house I'd fought so hard for, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and emptiness. The legal battle had ended in my favor, but it hadn't left me feeling as victorious as I'd expected. The house was mine now, yet it seemed to carry the weight of all the broken promises, the lies, and the fractured family ties that had surfaced during this fight. As I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, memories washed over me. The walls, the floors, the rooms, they all held echoes of my childhood, of moments when I truly believed I was part of this family. I could almost hear David's voice calling me son, almost see my mom standing in the kitchen, her warmth filling the house. But the memories felt faded now, tainted by the truth I'd uncovered. Over the next few weeks, I settled into the house, slowly starting to make it my own. Mark helped me with the paperwork, making sure everything was set in my name. He was the one constant through all of this, someone who reminded me that family didn't have to be defined by blood or titles. It was about loyalty, support, and standing by each other. And he'd done that for me when no one else had. The fallout with David, Chase, and Bella was brutal. They cut all ties with me, which was both a relief and a wound I hadn't expected. I'd spent so many years yearning for their acceptance, believing that I could somehow earn my place in their family if I just tried hard enough. But now, I could finally see the truth. I was never truly one of them. And as painful as that realization was, it also felt liberating. I didn't have to live up to their expectations or chase their approval anymore. I was free to be my own person, to define family on my own terms. David tried one last time to reach out, sending me a long email filled with accusations and bitterness. He blamed me for tearing the family apart, for betraying his trust, for ruining what he claimed had been a perfect family. But I didn't respond. I'd said everything I needed to say in that courtroom, and I wasn't about to let him drag me back into his twisted version of events. He'd made his choice and I'd made mine. There was no going back. With time, the house began to feel like mine. I painted the walls, brought in my own furniture, and hung up pictures of my mom, reminders of the person who'd been the true constant in my life. I made a promise to her memory that I'd honor her in every corner of this home, that I'd build a life here that was filled with the kind of warmth and love she'd always given me. In the end, I realized that I didn't need David, Chase, or Bella to feel complete. The house was more than just a building. It was a symbol of my resilience, a reminder that I was capable of standing up for myself, even when it meant standing alone. I'd lost the illusion of a family, but I'd gained something far more valuable, self-respect and the knowledge that I didn't have to settle for less than I deserved. As I stood in my new home, surrounded by the life I was building, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. I was finally free from the shadows of the past, ready to move forward on my own terms. And in that quiet moment, I knew that I'd made the right choice, that this was just the beginning of a future I could truly call my own.